I'm glad we had the opportunity to applaud you twice. Because last night I saw the emojis on the preview of the slides, and I thought the emojis were definitely the winner for me. Okay. I think it's really interesting that this whole workshop was focused on reporting, and everybody keeps telling us that's at the end of the process, and it's too late. That what you really need is to be at the beginning of the process, when the plane is taking off, if you will, rather than when it's landing. And I think that that's really the greatest challenge, I feel, as an institutional leader. What can I do for my investigators at my institution? And I think it would be good to get a view of the people on the platform here, and then maybe open that up as to what is institutional responsibility in 2019 related to this issue, and how can that actually be actualized. We heard from Gita what's being done at Duke, and I think that's exemplary, and maybe that would be a model. One thing that crossed my mind as you were speaking, Shai, at the end, is I agree, having that community of champions is really crucial. And I think that NIH had an analogous challenge a while back, and they solved it in large part by creating a community of champions, institutional champions. And by that I mean they created the position of the research subject advocate, where they actually funded at different sites a person whose responsibility it was for the protection of human subjects. And that person became in a community of other research subject advocates who began to share information just exactly the way you described it. So I would just wonder, shouldn't NIH be creating what I'll call a research integrity advocate to be that champion at these institutions and to begin to create that culture? I just throw that out as an idea because I really resonate with the point that you made. But I would like to just focus for a moment on how we go to the institutional level.
Maybe I could start because I've given some thoughts to this. Firstly, if you see an institution that's got good practice around all of these, my hypothesis is if you go back 5 years into their press releases, the reason is that they've had someone who's been engaging in research malpractice, so they've been highly motivated to do something. And I think that speaks to what's wrong with the approach, which is that we identify this as being malfeasant acts done by bad actors for deliberate personal gain in our institutions. And when the person from that office comes to visit my lab, it means they either think I'm stupid or I'm at it. And the chance of them getting any traction with me making incremental improvements in a body of research that's already reasonably good goes out the window. So instead of focusing on that FFP end of things, institutions should rather say that research performance is like blood pressure in the human population. And if you can take everyone's blood pressure down by 2 millimeters of mercury, you'll do more good than focusing on the people with the very high levels of systolic hypertension. So we should adopt the same approach here. Now, the second thing is, you talked a bit about grassroots types of organisations. Over the last year, we've been involved in a group called the UK Reproducibility Network, set up by Marcus Manafo, who was involved also in Shai's Jamboree in October last year. And UK Reproducibility Network's got 3 legs to it. It's got local groups made up largely of early career researchers who self-organise, provide mutual support across departmental lines and mentoring and involve and organise local journal clubs, which in a very English way, which I'm not sure I completely get, are called reproducibility. And one of the things we do is send them teapots along with their reading list so they can sit in nice Oxford colleges. And and it's great, don't get me wrong. We'd have something a little bit stronger in ours. There's community stakeholders, so for instance journals and funders and the like, and they've been very generous with small amounts of money to keep us going. And the third group of people that can join are academic institutions. But for academic institutions to join, they have to express a commitment to research improvement in their institution, manifest in the appointment of someone who's got protected time in their job in a senior academic role, whose job is research improvement, who sits aside from the normal research management structure. And we've got a few institutions already signed up to that because of what it allows them to say back to the ref about how good they are. I'm delighted that Edinburgh, at the beginning of this week, decided that Edinburgh was going to join UK Reproducibility Network. And then that starts to bring together the idea of local communities of early career researchers, along with institutions having to do something to raise their game without having to, appear on the front of the New York Times as a motivation for doing so. That Marcus Manaf was quite clever, really.
I think the UK Reproducibility Network is a really encouraging development. I think the greatest gap and need is in the area of training early career researchers, and by that I mean graduate students, really making this part of the graduate student training process and reinforcing it. So I think, what Shai talked about, these standardized modules that are adaptable and free to access sounds very encouraging. So I feel optimistic, actually. I do feel that we're now at a moment where there's a lot of awareness. There's a genuine interest from all the stakeholders, really, to engage. I think the other interesting data point from our survey is we asked authors our researchers to identify the key constituents that have a responsibility and can really move the needle on reproducibility. And, overwhelmingly, the response was researchers. The responsibility to move the needle on these issues, the power to move the needle on these issues, does lie with the researchers, but they have to be supported with an infrastructure, and particularly at the institutional level of training and mentoring, but then all along the way through the funder mechanism, through the journal process.
You said, what can NIH do? So that's not we. That's pointing to one entity. And I, of course, can't speak for NIH, and I have to be very careful what I say. I want to go back to what you said at the beginning. You said that we heard that the journals are at the end of the process, and I don't buy that. And the reason is simple. Science is circular. I mean, you publish your papers, and then you come back for your next grant, and you use those papers to justify what you want to do next, and it's a continuous cycle. So the journal, you might say that the journals are at the end of the process, but they also at the beginning of the process for the next round. So in that regard, we all have to do our part in increasing the transparency. And I don't think the journals. I agree that the journals are not the rigor police. They're not supposed to be. And I think what Nature Publishing Group did was the right thing. Is to just say, tell us what you did, and then it's up to the peer reviewers and the scientific community to decide what they think about the data. Is it of high quality or not? So transparency is obviously key. But I think that if you think of the major stakeholders, no one wants to make the so-called first move. So, I mean, I give many talks all over the place. I meet with vice provosts for research, and they said, "Are you crazy? I'm not going to change my way because what I need is to make sure that we bring in money. And as long as the reviewers, which are the peers of all of us, okay, are judging the papers, the grants based on how many papers you publish and in what journal, I mean, why on earth would I going to tell my investigators to just do rigorous research? I'm going to tell them publish in the single journal paper, in single name journals, okay? And so you can see this, that kind of everyone is reluctant to make the first move, and that's why I really resonated with the idea that it has to be a grassroots. And a grassroots is not only from the institutions. You can imagine a grassroots from the journals and from the funders. I'm a weed at NIH. Without Veronique, we wouldn't have had the Nature Publishing Group. she was the champion that made it possible to get Nature Publishing Group to change its way. So yes, we had the workshop and everything, but that's what's needed. You need these champions in each place to get the different stakeholders to change their ways.
I think we'll now open it to the audience.
I think people know I'm from NIH in the Division of Biomedical Research Workforce. So I've been part of a scientific data council where we've actually been charged with ensuring that NIH's training grants actually have within them resources, modules that will allow training in rigor, reproducibility, and also data science. This is in progress now. It's actually going to come out so that this is going to be required in training grants that are submitted effective May 2020 for rigor and reproducibility. We're still under some discussion as to how we're going to request the data science part. We definitely are in a data science world, and actually hopefully we'll have made some decisions soon. The National Institute of General Medical Sciences actually has on their website resources for people to access so they can take a look at that. And then my group is actually going to be putting together some resources for data science. So, we are implementing something. I know NINDS just put out a really good training grant request that has a lot of the data science part in there. But, definitely go on to the website, and those are publicly accessible. People can take a look at them.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is John Garden. I very much admire the talks that I've heard today, and I certainly agree with the emphasis that has been pointed out on culture. I think that is a very essential part of this whole discussion. But what I have not heard, and I'm concerned about, is inter-stovepipe culture, or lack thereof. I've seen this in many forms, of course, physical sciences versus social sciences and so forth. It was most dramatically brought home to me when I had prostate cancer, and I did a risk-benefit web search, and the websites written by surgeons said, well, one thing's for sure, if you're not going to go with benign neglect and you want to actually do something, you got to understand the only hope you have of getting this thing straightened out is surgery. Now, internal medicine might do you some good, after the surgery and like that, but you start with the surgery. The websites written by internists said the last thing you want to even consider is surgery. There are many ways that we can deal effectively with prostate cancer from medicine, but stay away from surgery. Okay, now as a member of the public, that sort of thing can be confusing. This morning I was very much impressed with Brian Nosek's discussion of the business in the psychiatric, psychological community of dealing with negative findings by accepting or rejecting papers on the basis of design as opposed to results. But I asked him on the side, I said, I like that. That sounds very good, very hopeful, but I'm concerned. Don't you worry about some people in science who will say, oh, we don't want any part of that. That's something the psychologists do. We don't do that. And he said, it's worse than that. He said, within psychology, we have that exact same reaction. To what extent have any of you encountered this sort of problem and incorporated that kind of adversarial stovepipe mentality as affecting the research that you're presenting today?
Anyone want to address this?
Well, first of all, I should say, in answer to the previous thing about reproducibility, Amy Reigelman on Twitter informs me that the University of Minnesota has got a reproducibility chapter in the US. So speak with her, and so you can do that. So we started off doing systematic reviews of animal models of stroke, and we found, as I showed you, that very few were randomized or blind or whatever. And then we were told by people in other communities, like the Alzheimer's and the Parkinson's communities and whatever, that they didn't have that problem. And over the years, I've been told by more research communities than I care to mention that they completely understand how that's an issue for these other guys, but it's not an issue for us. To which I usually reply, well, demonstrate that by doing a systematic review of the quality of reporting in your field, and a few brave souls do. And then, guess what? They find that they've also got a problem. So it may be that there are some fields of research that don't have a problem, but my view is that unless you've got good empirical data to show that you don't have a problem, my Bayesian prior is that it's highly likely that you do.
I'd want to add here on the individual level, not on community level. I give lots of talks, and almost always there's one person in the room who's very negative. And almost inevitably, it's not going to be a junior scientist. And I fully understand it. Coming to terms that maybe what you've done in the last 30 years wasn't done in the best possible way is very difficult. So resistance is in the senior scientists, I understand. And what's gratifying is to see in the young generation that they get it right away and they buy into it.
I just comment that I thought that the point that you made that came from the workshop, that you had to engage all levels, not just the junior people. And so training grants are great, but the real institutional culture definers are not the junior people. And having the senior people buy in, and not just buy in, but champion these issues, I think is absolutely crucial for institutional connectedness. So
I think the only point I wanted to make was I think there's a really fundamental issue there that Stephen raised earlier today is, do we have a consensus on what we mean by a good study, right? So across some of these dimensions of study design, do we understand? Is there agreement? Is there a consensus? And I would say there isn't. There are some of us who do believe that the land is for not only should be reported, but should be incorporated into study design. But I would say at the moment, the vast majority does not incorporate, and if it is reported, it's because there's an enforcement and compliance mechanism. So I think that's actually something we do need to tackle.
I agree. I would just comment, though, that I think that there's probably a lot more agreement on what's bad science.
Yes.
And it may well be that that's the first place to focus, because I think you'll probably be able to drive agreement there more easily than what is perfect science. And that might get you a good way toward the goal, even if it's not going to be everything that you want. Yes, Arturo.
Hi, Barry. I want to address this point that has been made. I think that one group that needs to really step up is this scientific elite. There are very few scientists, or for example, like Barry Kohler here, who's a member of the National Academy, who's made tremendous contributions, who has gone to the trenches on this. We're in Constitution Avenue, it took 10 years for the National Academy of Science to respond to a crisis that was coming in science. And if you ask where were the information coming from, it was coming from editors, it was coming in many ways from the grassroots. Most scientists today want to do rigorous, good science. And the problem is they are caught in a system by which they are not judged by it. period. They, we keep hearing it. What do you get promoted? You get all it. And until the scientific leadership of this country comes out and says, give me good, rigorous work. I don't care where you publish it. Publish it on the web, and I'll admire you. This is not going to change because they're caught into this. And what this is where I think is the next step. And unless that happens, you're really going to have, in every institution, there are scientific leaders. They're the most respected people. They're often the most silent ones. And they have grown into the system. They are hesitant to criticize it. They worry what it would do for science. But they need to recognize that the danger to science, unless this thing gets addressed. And that this is why we're here. But this should have happened 10 years ago. And I'm sorry for making this criticism, but this is what I see.
Thank you. We have, yes, please.
I wanted to come back to the point of design that we talked about earlier, and what makes a good study, because eventually that's where we want to be, is actually having studies that are well designed, and going at it through the reporting angle and checklist is a very convoluted way of getting at actually designing studies well in the first place, and it requires education and all that. But I was really struck by the data you showed, Soumya, about people saying that they're using these checklists after they've submitted their article, and they actually are using that in their work ongoing. So we have an educational aspect of these checklists. Now, I contrast that with the observation that Malcolm made, that actually it's really hard to get the right language and to really explain these concepts, because assessors disagree on whether a manuscript actually is compliant or not. So this is, the elements of designs that are on these checklists are not that complex, but it's really difficult to express them with language that we can all agree on. And a challenge that I would want to put there is, like, can we do something to this point about coordinating between different stakeholders, between funders and journals and institutions who train, to actually agree on using the same concepts and the same language at different stages of the process? Would that help, and how would we go about that?
So, I think, that was part of the spirit behind the minimal standards working group, right? The idea, if you establish a minimum standard, that it would iterate throughout the research life cycle, and a tool like the checklist could be used in the laboratory. And from my point of view, I think that thinking very much came on the heels of the feedback we had from Nature Journal authors, that a very striking number are continuing to use the checklist, and we've had anecdotal feedback to that effect. So I believe, and perhaps this is naive because I'm not enmeshed in the complex bureaucracies of funders and institutions, I believe that in principle it should be possible. And in principle, Malcolm, you can speak to this, it should be possible for something like MDAR to actually be piloted at the level of institutions in the context of a reproducibility network, where you have a group of institutions who are committed to advancing, a reproducibility agenda.
Yes, so the first thing is, as you know, we've been walking the walk a little bit. If people look at the exploration elaboration document, they'll see the one person that's already cited as having been consulted is Natalie Percy-Dussert, who's been channeling the revision of the ARRIVE guidance through the NC3Rs. So in as much as MDAR relates to animal experiments, we've tried to get the language to be so similar as to be virtually indistinguishable, so that they're interoperable. I think what's going to really shift the needle here, I think, is institutions getting bothered enough to say, well, here's a checklist. How does our research output perform? What can we do to improve it? And making people who are good at improving it, making that a thing that gets them promotion and tenure. And there are ways that we can start to do that. And of course, a tool that will measure outputs, and I've got a dog in this fight because we're trying to automate some of this stuff, but a tool that will automate assessment could be used by institutions, by journals, by funding it. One tool, many purposes. That's the kind of economies of scale we can get if we sort it out. But coming back to your point about the language, I wouldn't blame the language for all of it. The agreement between assessors on what the unit of assessment is, on whether a paper is reporting biological or technical replicates. The thing is, the peer reviewers do not understand those concepts sufficiently well to agree with each other. And I think that's a problem.
I can second that, actually, because in the process of implementing the nature checklist, one of the things we discovered was the lack of clarity in reporting and the kind of the struggle, really, with reporting the experimental units, the sample size. We would often find there was a conflation of the experimental unit versus the number of times an experiment had been replicated, or pooling of numbers across experiments. So that actually what you're showing is not a representative experiment, but it's an aggregate of data across independent experiments, but it's presented as though, n equals 30 worms is from a single experiment. A lot of confusion about technical and biological replicates, and we saw this in specific fields, preclinical animal research, but cell and molecular biology. So fields that are not born quantitative, that are inherently qualitative and descriptive, but that as science has evolved, have really been forced into a quantitative mold, And I suspect that other journals in the audience probably face similar challenges.
So,
Can I just add, we do, I think you're right, absolutely, we do. But relating to Veronique's point also about how you set standards that can help with moving forward, we found that, we focus more on methods, and we have found that people have told us that even though what we ask them to put in is annoying, afterwards they know how useful it is, and they actually make their lab use it, and make their lab do it because it's so helpful.
Yeah.
So it can have that effect going forward.
yes, and please, everyone, for the people who are listening outside, if you can just please indicate your name and your title.
Right, Yarimar Carrasquillo, Principal Investigator at NCCIH. So, we've talked about how these checklists at the end point of the study are useful, but might be a little bit late, and then how incorporating training components early in the career of the students or the projects or things like that, like what I mentioned with the training grants and the making them a requirement, right? What I was wondering is, so now we have the two ends, right? Is there a way that institutions and funding agencies can also incorporate some sort of like checkpoints throughout in between those two stages, right? Because someone had a slide showing that, the information comes in, I know what I should be doing, that doesn't mean that I will do it. So you have all these training requirements, for example, but are they being, everyone needs to renew their grants. Grants are not for just 1 year. And even at the intramural program, we also get evaluated constantly, and I cannot think of any scientist that the only evaluation that they have is just the end product. So what I'm wondering is if we can, as institutions and funding agencies, if we can somehow incorporate, report how many of your trainees are actually, you mentioned, I think it was 4 things. So we could start with those 4 things, like how many of your trainees are actually doing blind studies, but you have to, for transparency purposes, you have to put how many are doing it blind and how many are not, and so on with all the different, and we could start building up on this list. You had 4, right, Shai? So is there a way to do that? Is that too hard? Is that practically impossible?
It's a very, very good question.
For accountability purposes, right?
So, NIH enhanced peer review in 2016, and it was modified in January 2019. And as far as I'm concerned, the most important parameter that was changed was that the investigator has to discuss the rigor of the prior research that's being used as key support for the application. So why do I think this is the most important thing? Is if they're using papers from the literature, then it won't have a big impact on them. But if they're using their own prior research, and they now have to say, well, this study, we did the study, and I think the results, give me a Ferrari based on these results. But they weren't blinded, they weren't randomized, and we had 3 animals per group, okay? That's going to lead, they're going to understand that that's not going to work. So down the road, again, this is a cyclic business. Down the road, they'll say, well, it's to my benefit to do things properly, so for my next grant, I can actually cite strong, rigorous data. So even though it's grant review that I'm talking about, it's an educational tool.
I understand, but I think accountability is very important. So, for example, I can tell you that 100% of my experiments, so I would have this beautiful graph of 100% of my experiments are blind. Everyone in my group has to do them blind. Yeah. How many unblind? None. Randomization, same thing, and so on. That is not being taken into account in a quantitative way. We're scientists, right? We like quantitation. So what I'm proposing is that we actually make the scientists, the principal investigators, report quantitatively what they are doing, and then take this into account for renewal purposes and for promotion and evaluation in quantitative ways, so that there's no, these are things that you cannot do with all the parameters, but you mentioned 4, I think that we're very straightforward. It's a yes or no, tell me how many you're doing, and the ones that you're not, then tell me why, what's the obstacle?
There's an issue with that, and that is, first of all, not all experiments can or should be, blinded, for example. Because if you're studying, pink and blue mice, you can't blind yourself.
That's where the explanation comes in.
Yeah, but that's not quantitative. That's so you say, you'd have to start explaining everything. I didn't blind this set of experiments because I couldn't, and so it's not quantitative anymore. And the other issue is that we have to make the distinction between exploratory and confirmatory studies. If you're doing exploratory research, it's not the same as a hypothesis testing or confirmatory study, as Brian worded it, because it's a different standard completely, and so I can't see. I see the value in getting across that you're a rigorous researcher, and that can come out by the data that you're using to try to get your funding. Okay. But I can't see it being quantified in an easy way.
And I think it's also a question of mentorship. Theoretically, everyone should have people who they are able to go to or who are responsible for overseeing that individual, whether it's a divisional head or a departmental chair. But we're back to institutions taking responsibility for providing that oversight and being able to make the subtle distinctions that may not be easy to make on a spreadsheet, but would be the crucial ones for deciding on promotion. But again, we're back to the institutional responsibility for creating the culture and the framework under which issues like this can be appropriately recognized and rewarded when they're done well.
And accountability, there needs to be accountability.
Right. Well, that's the way we measure accountability, is whether you get a grant, whether you get a publication, and whether you get promoted. So those are the hallmarks of accountability. But I think we're going to need to go on to the next question. Yes?
So, this will follow up in many ways. So I'm going to actually...
Just go name and institution.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Again.
Steve Goodman, Stanford.
Thank you.
So I'm going to actually take up a sort of throwaway comment you made, which is... And this is going to sound crazy, but it actually is very similar in spirit, which is if we started to judge scientists not just on their best research and institutions, but by their worst, Think about it. I'm serious. So if the worst research you do is, blinded, where it's appropriate, is of high quality, that is a certain measure of quality. In fact, I'm a fan of tennis, and there are these incredible statistical analyses of what makes Federer and Nadal great. It turns out that it's not that they play better on key points, but that their opponents all play worse. So the mark of a true professional is at their worst, they're still very, very good. So if we evaluated both extremes of the spectrum, and that we didn't tolerate a lot of throwaway research from anybody, it would change the evaluation, which is not to say you don't look at the best, but you look at the entire spectrum, and as you say, maybe quantify it. And okay, we tolerate a little at the bottom, but not a lot at the bottom. And even if they do some Nobel Prize work at the top, we don't tolerate 90% of it being ignorable. So it's just a thought. The other two very quick points, I really like Shai's presentation of the CONSORT guidelines, and it made me think of like MS-DOS and things that make sense to computer scientists but not to the user. That clearly was not. None of these checklists are user friendly. And I think the idea of prioritizing what's most important, because out of CONSORT, the key elements that are always presented, we saw it today, are 4 or 5. We never see the other 25. So if that's what's so important, it should be in big red letters right up front. And we should look at all these checklists and think about what makes them user-friendly. And piloting would help. Otherwise, we lose, and just as Shai said, the final thing I'll say about changing the culture is if we empower the young to do methodologic meta-research within their own fields. So the journal clubs don't just turn into a critique of of a paper, but if they find methodologic issues that bother them, that we empower them to say, you can actually turn this into a paper. Maybe everybody in that room, all the second-year graduate students, look at the use of cell counting and see what technology is used and how accurate it is. They can, A, get a paper out of it, B, have an achievement that actually improves measurement in their own field, and they begin to be sensitized to the weaknesses in their own literature and how they can fix it. We could create an entire army of motivated, well, I'll call meta-researchers, but they're in their own field. They're not coming from outside fields, and they're improving what they're doing. So if they saw every journal club as an opportunity for identifying methods that they could look at systematically in depth, instead of just saying, another junky paper, a really good paper, in fact, it's not very good, we would be able to empower the next generation in ways that they are not right now.
So on that, in our neuroscience PhD program, we try with maybe 5 or 6 of them in a year, start to do a systematic review in the subject area using the models that they're then going to go on and use in the wet lab, and it's remarkable. So I've got one PhD student who went off actually to Janssen to do, and her boss there phoned me up saying, how does she know all this stuff about what works and what does? Because she's just not been able to make sense of the papers, and said, so I was asking all the right questions because she'd made a systematic attempt to evaluate the literature. I wanted to touch on a couple of issues. One was someone said exploratory versus hypothesis testing research, so we could have another whole week of a meeting about that. But my bottom line, just so you know what I think, you can't make a knowledge claim from exploratory research. Full stop, nada, zil. The only person who's going to use it, or who should use it, is you when you're planning your future experiments. So if you want to do it unblinded, unrandomized, with tiny power calculations, that's your problem, because I suspect that you'll be trying to recapture that effect that you got with N of 3 for the next 6 months as you run through it. Finally, there is another approach to how individual groups might try and improve. So Magla talked earlier on about the Equipped Consortium, which I'm involved with. One of the things that we are developing is a quality management scheme which will allow labs to self-evaluate against criteria for what they're doing and put in place measures to improve their performance, and then be able to self-assert that they're functioning aligned with the requirements of the scheme, and then there'll be a higher level gold certification that people will maybe pay for. But there will be things that you can do to say, we're a lab that has got this badge, and this is our evidence that says how we've got here, that you can then use in grants and papers and recruitment and whatever.
Where will that be?
So it will be published open source if I've got anything to do with it. It's currently in a beta test, which is in that horrible Microsoft software platform called Excel. And we're waiting for a smart developer who's going to use something called Java, apparently. No, they're going to use Java or some kind of fancy fantush thing that's going to... But it links through to the documentation that you're going to require and templates and all that sort of thing. So the first requirement is you've got to have a quality improvement champion. Tick. You've got to have a strategy. You've got to have a whistleblowing charter. All sorts of things like that to have it. So you can self-assert that you're functioning at a level, and groups can use that, because one of the challenges for me, and I speak as a kind of sinner only half repented, is when I try and improve research, there's stuff that I think, oh, that might be important, but I'm completely blindsided to the stuff that I don't realize other people think is important. And having a kind of a starting point template that runs through these things can be helpful. And maybe in some ways the MDAR checklist is that for journals. Of the stuff that's on this, what do you think is important? Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Maybe we should look at it.
I would suggest that you try to gamify it and then let everybody see everybody else's score, because that seems to drive a lot of people's behaviors to ever increasing heights.
Not always for the best.
My name is Ann Planta from National Institute of Standards and Technology. We're actually a metrology laboratory, so I'm going to sound a little wonky here. I thought I was getting up to respond to something Soumya said about how do we really know what a good study is? You know, how do we evaluate that? But then you said something about metadata or meta-analysis, which is really important. Shai said something about making assumptions that that data that you are, or published papers that you're basing your research on are valid. And then you just said something about, I've forgotten now, about, so many things. So anyway, so from a metrology or measurement science point of view, I look at this problem as a problem really that sort of can be perhaps put in a box and organized in a systematic way through measurement science, which, one of the credos of measurement science is that if you have a measurement, that measurement consists of two things: a value, a number, and the uncertainty around that value. And so everything we do has some uncertainty around it. Everything from the assumptions that we make as we are thinking about what are we going to do our experiments on, we're making assumptions based on things that we think we know, but we may not know. And somebody thinks we should make some, report some things, and somebody else thinks we should report some other things. And it might depend on the experiment that we're doing, and maybe we have to report some things, maybe we don't. The way that I look at this is that every single step of our research, whether it's research design or whether it's actually carrying out the measurements, whether it's reporting, the statistics that's being done, the analysis and all the assumptions that are made in the algorithms that you're using for the analysis, every single step has a whole bunch of places where there is uncertainty. Everything, even the things we think we know well, still has a certain amount of uncertainty. So we use antibodies. Part of the uncertainty is, the evaluation of those antibodies and how are they characterized. And we never know completely, but we know what we've done to reduce that uncertainty. There may be other things that we haven't done that could have reduced uncertainty. Every single step of the way, we make some elements, we make some activities to reduce our uncertainties, but we never get it all. And so if we were in the habit of reporting all of that meta-analysis that we did, all the control experiments, all of the tracking down of assumptions, all of the tracking down of manufacturers' data, if we reported all of those things that we did that reduced our uncertainty in the data that we collected and in the results that we came to and the conclusions that we drew, and we reported all of those things that still are elements, contributors to uncertainty that we haven't been able to track down, then everybody who reads the paper, whether it is confirmatory research or whether it's preliminary results, you know what is known. You know what is known with some level of confidence, you know where the lack of confidence is, and you know what was done with no level of confidence. And you can make a decision then. I mean, you could even codify that, but for most of the research that we do, it's very difficult to put numbers on that uncertainty. But you could still report it and have a list of criteria by which you are more or less confident in every step of the research program that you did. That's how I think about it.
Thank you. I just comment, Geeta might want to comment, but one of the advantages of the electronic notebook is version control.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And auditable. So if you put your e-notebook, made it available related to your paper, you would have all of the information you just said.
In principle, that would be great. Now, has anybody paid to make a tool that researchers could use to capture all of those elements of their protocol so that all of that information was in one place and easy to communicate?
But then we'd have to do a study to see how many people actually looked at it. And I suspect that would be very small, but mostly the really important people, namely your competitors. And I was told early on that you should cherish your competitors because they're the only ones who will really read your papers. So I think that these are really important considerations, and there may be ways to provide tools to gain some information about that. But what you just described would probably take me about 15 pages to write for every one of my papers to mentally go back and figure out exactly each of those steps along the way.
Well, you don't do it after the fact. I mean, this is, I think, the point that Sonia is making is that you can't capture that at the end.
Yeah.
But everybody practices this to a greater or lesser extent.
Absolutely.
Every time they, pick up a pipette or however they do their research. So that information is there, but it is not thought about in a rigorous way. It's not thought about in a systematic way, and it's not reported.
So maybe go, yeah.
So Chris Chambers has got a great quote about that, or a great way of describing this, about writing stuff down, writing down what you're going to do and whether you've done it. He says, your most important collaborator in the world is yourself 6 months ago, and they don't answer emails. And
so I'd like to, because sounds like we have a couple of minutes here while people are thinking of additional questions. So I'd like to throw in a bit of a blue sky question. And usually in situations like this, I always ask, have we identified every stakeholder? And are there stakeholders we should be thinking about in terms of these opportunities? And the two stakeholders that come to my mind that we really haven't talked about today is people who report on scientific advances, and whether or not we should be creating a checklist for them so that they can be better informed about how they write about science. And of course, now we know that the general public is very interested in every new study that comes out, but is not in a great position to make judgments about the quality and the uncertainty of those. And should we be thinking about a checklist for the general public that they can use to see whether or not what they've just read or heard is something that they should pay a lot of attention to, a little bit of attention to, or ignore? So I just throw this out to be a little provocative, but I think it's something that will inevitably come from the types of discussions we're having here today. And if you can think of other stakeholders, I think this would be a good opportunity to think about them.
So you haven't had any inquiries into how awful your press are. We have, but we seem to be following behind you in just about everything else in our public discourse just now. So no doubt you'll be not far afterwards. We had an inquiry into our press's behaviour in leaking details of young children who'd been kidnapped and the like. And one of the things that the government inquiry covered was their coverage of scientific stories. How everything you read about in our main paper said, coffee either causes or cures cancer, and every week it would be a different headline. And the guy who was the owner of the newspaper was called to account in front of the committee, and they said, why do you write this rubbish? And he took from his briefcase the press releases issued by the institutions who'd done the research, and verbatim his newspaper had carried what the institution said. So I think there are issues around about consumers of information, and there are some very good examples we've got in the UK, like Sense About Science, but a lot of the responsibility lies with institutions. That graph I showed you about the NXY059 drug that fell over in clinical trial. In the 48 hours following the publication of that clinical trial, AstraZeneca's share price fell by 17%, $9.6 billion, which is about the same as the gross domestic product, I think, of Barbados. And it took 7 years for their market capitalization to get back to its starting point. And yet still, those who invest in our pharmaceutical industry are completely uninformed and unaware and unconcerned about the quality of the biomedical research endeavour, which costs $300 billion a year, and much of which, if you believe Paul Glasziou and Ian Chalmers, and I do mostly, is wasted for things that we could fix tomorrow if we wish to. So why, and maybe the reason that the public aren't so well informed is because all of us in the room are going, yeah, we know it's really, really awful, but we shouldn't say that quite so loudly, otherwise the NIH vote will go down in Congress, they won't get nearly as much money, and my Medical Research Council will start pulling money away from me, and it would just create too much chaos if we were actually upfront about the value that the public actually get from the biomedical research they pay for directly through their taxes, indirectly through their charitable giving, through their prescription charges when they buy their medicines. It's a big problem, and there is a fear, I think, that if people knew quite how big a problem, just as well no one's watching online, if people knew how big a problem it was, there'd be a lot of reduction in public confidence in the biomedical research endeavour.
So there may be a funding opportunity here if we can prepare a checklist for investors.
Look, we spend $300 billion a year on biomedical research. How much do we spend on research improvement, on making sure that research is of the highest quality? How difficult is it for Brian to get, it's no more than a couple of dollars, but it's not that much, to keep the Open Science Framework on the road, an initiative which has done more in a short term to give scientists the ability to say what they're going to do and then allow people to check that that's actually what they did? What proportion of that is the amount? It's tiny. And yet he's spending half his time going around with a begging bowl trying to get funding, as is the Equator Network, as are all of these organisations that are making important contributions to research infrastructure. And I think, I'm a European socialist, obviously, but I think
you're soon going to be out of the Europe.
You're a European socialist too, just you've been there a bit longer. The benefits to the entire research community from that collective investment to us being able to do our job to a much higher level of precision and aptitude, and in time get far better, bigger, larger gains for the investment that's going into the research. I mean, it's just a no-brainer. If I was trying to sell you shares in an aircraft company and I said, how much of your money do you spend on R&D? They say we spend 30% of our turnover on R&D. And I say, and how much do you spend on quality improvement and quality management in your factories? They go, we don't bother about that. It's not important to us. Would you? Crazy.
We have a question over there.
Less of a question, more of a comment.
First name and institution.
I'm Kelly Dunham. I'm from Pecori. So I wanted to respond to the call for grassroots efforts, stakeholders. Some of you in the room are aware of a voluntary sort of organic organization that's formed. It's the Ensuring Value in Research Funders Forum. We've been around for about 3 years and involves around 40 funding institutions from around the world. So public, charities, everything from preclinical through applied research. And we came together and developed a set of guiding principles and consensus statement that we believe will raise the probability of impact in the research we fund. So it addresses things all along the research production pathway, and we are working to really characterize what good practice looks like and learn from one another so that we can potentially set out some minimum standards and recommendations for the broader ecosystem. I also wanted to respond to a comment earlier about pushback, and even within this organization, we have had funders that say, well, you can't do that, like that's impossible. And I think that by bringing examples to the table, you can show what is possible and we can really learn from each other and move forward. The other thing I wanted to comment on just very quickly is the idea of whose responsibility it is to ensure that transparent and well documented results are going out to the public. So it's not a press release. maybe it's a lay translation of the research findings. And I think at PCORI we have taken that on as it's our responsibility. So we have a translation center, and we work to make sure that we are documenting the results. We have a lay summary and a clinical summary that goes out publicly. And so I don't know how many other funders are doing that, but that's one approach. And peer review. We have our own peer review process, which is different. We call what other people call peer review merit review. So our peer review also takes a look at the methods and the findings and actually comments back to researchers, our awardees, and asks them to report in greater detail, and that is also publicly reported. So, I think funders can play a bigger role in terms of making sure that the full results are available publicly.
Yeah, and that's on the final paper, not on the grant application. That's on what they
the final report. That's right.
Thank you. Anyone want to comment? Or? Okay, so please.
Hi, I'm Cindy Sheffield from NIH, both the NIH Library and the National Institute on Aging. I'm working on a special project called ALZPED. It's the Alzheimer's preclinical efficacy database, and it is looking at the rigor and transparency within these articles. And so we have about 900 articles now that have been evaluated for 24 elements of experimental design, as well as divided into the animal models, what agents are being used, and as well as the targets that are associated, and listing outcomes. I wanted to kind of just bring it back to the checklists, and we learned early on you weren't going to be able to evaluate in quantitative ways. So we were able to quickly figure out that we can check off whether something was reported or not reported. And one of the goals of this database is to create awareness and hopefully change the culture, just to say, did someone report out on that specific element design? So if perhaps other similar projects happen in other disciplines, that might help improve some of this transparency that we're trying to provide.
Thank you.
John Garden, retired from the National Center for Health Statistics. I just wanted to address very briefly the question you brought up, Barry, about other stakeholder communities. And an important and very large and varied stakeholder community is public health industry in general, which would include caregivers, the community hospital groups, the nursing homes, the various people who are where the rubber meets the road, where they take the product from the science and actually give it to, or the benefits of it, to the actual public who need the care. And I would include nurses, retirement homes, such as where we live now, and all of the various organizations who are very numerous and very concerned and can actually put some of this to use where the medical knowledge reaches the actual patients.
Thank you. The implementers who have to make the decision, yes or no.
Yes.
Well, we have a couple of more minutes. I don't know if the discussion has stimulated the panel to want to reflect on some final thoughts. If you do, we have a couple of more minutes.
You always make me speak first, because then you sound wise, because you've had a chance to reflect. And yeah, he isn't actually wiser than me. I hope not. Some of you might have looked at what we did in terms of trying to evaluate the checklist that we were proposing and think that was a bit over-engineered. Why would we go to all that trouble for something that we didn't even know if people were going to use it or not? I think there's something really fundamentally important in the way that those of us who are concerned about improving the quality of the research that is done go about our business. And that's exemplified to me in the results of our Icarus study, where we took a prediction where many people in that space, in that field, believed that doing A would cause B so much that they didn't need to test it. They could just tell everyone to do A and good things would happen. And the most important thing about that Icarus study is to burst that balloon. And when we seek to improve science by manipulating or changing the incentive system or by introducing new checklists or whatever, I think it's absolutely beholden on us to demonstrate that the intervention that we're proposing that will have a desirable effect actually does have that desirable effect. And there are different ways of doing that, because if you had a very low burden intervention, you might just want to run a manufacturing process control chart to see what happened and see if things changed and if you had a higher tariff intervention, you might want to go as far as a randomized control trial to see if there was any benefit. And one of the difficulties we have in this space is that we don't even have a research vocabulary, we don't even have the research methods for there to be a community of people who do research on research and say, yeah, for that intervention, that's the kind of experiment you need to do to see if it works. And so what I think we need to do is proceed cautiously if we're demanding that our colleagues and peers change their practice, try and seek evidence for the impact of things making a change when we think they should, but much more importantly, try and future-proof us so we're not sitting having the same conversation in 20 or 30 years' time by developing the science and the methodology that allows us scientists to approach the improvement of science in a scientific way.
Sorry?
Well said. I wanted to say two things. One, about stakeholders. A stakeholder that we haven't spoken about is pharma.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to mention that the Equipped initiative that's going on in Europe that Malcolm is running is a tour de force of how interactions between academia and pharma can work. And I think it's a laudable thing to mention. It's a joy to see how they're sharing data, sharing resources, sharing brain power to try to bring the best possible products forward. The second thing I wanted to say is advice I always give to people who go on travel is you lay out on the bed the bare minimum of clothing and things you need to take, and then half of it leave behind, okay? And still you'll have way too much. And this analogy goes to the checklist. It's extremely easy to say, oh yeah, this is very important and that's very important. And they are. I'm not saying they're not very important. And oh, we should also know this, and this will help us to do systematic reviews, and this will help us to do that kind of analysis, and this will do this, and this will do that. And then you end up with a very long list, like the 38 items in the CONSORT checklist. Okay? So the difficulty is to prioritize, and that would be, I think, the one thing I say, all these great initiatives moving forward, to come up with a mechanism to prioritize and stage the introduction of the checklist.
So I want to thank all of. Do you want to?
No, actually, I think Malcolm and Shai have said it all.
Right.
I'm looking forward to Shai's feedback on the checklist, actually.
So I want to thank our great panelists and also say on that final note, remember the B17, put it all on one index card. So maybe that's something to keep in mind.